I am just going to keep going with the legalism study that we've started together and just keep moving from where we've been. And after 4 messages, I am finally ready to offer you what I hope is an accurate, useful, well-rounded definition of legalism. After talking about it all this time, finally we can maybe nail down what it is we're actually talking about in this series. I was asked after the last time I spoke, so what is legalism, by somebody, and that's what we've been trying to figure out. Hopefully we've covered enough ground that we can actually do this. Now, I told you from the very beginning of this series that many Christians assume an understanding of legalism, but have never given much thought as to what legalism truly is. They just kind of use the word according to whatever standard they've always had, and they just keep going with that. But they've never given any really diligent thought to what it is they're talking about, and that has led to some problems. We use the accusation of legalism without precisely knowing what we are saying, I think, many times. And to a large degree, Christians sometimes have different ideas over who is to be called a legalist, and you might have 2 groups of people condemning each other for the same thing, and it's just a big mess, basically. And the whole purpose of this series, especially the first part of this series, is to clear away that mess and try to get something decent, something that we can actually defend, a good definition of legalism that we can actually use as we assess ourselves and as we assess other people that we meet. We could not do that, however, without the first 4 messages of this series, which is why we spent all that time covering all these different aspects of biblical teaching, trying to get some idea from the Bible that will guide us in our understanding of what legalism actually is. And now in this 5th message, we can actually condense all that information and jam it all together into hopefully what will be a good definition for this word that'll help us as we try to use it in the future. And just so you do not consider this to be too tedious, wanted to give a kind of indirect exhortation from Proverbs 25:2. It is the glory of God to conceal things, but the glory of kings is to search things out. So the whole aim is to be kingly and try to search out this matter as diligently as we can. God may have concealed it, but we're going to try to work through it, and we're going to be kingly about it and try to actually get good, honest, well-argued answers for what we're talking about. So that's what we're doing as we talk about definition of legalism. Now, at long last, here's my definition. This is the way that I have summarized it in my own mind, especially as I started moving through this series. Here is my definition. Legalism is the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. I'll go ahead and give you that again because it's going to be important to remember, and you'll hear it many times throughout the rest of this message anyway, so hopefully you'll get it by the time we're done. Legalism, the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. Or if you want something a little more limber, it is the mistake of thinking you're getting more obedient when you're actually getting more sinful, if you want to put it that way. You have virtue, the idea of virtue, the word that I'm using, it's the righteousness of your life. It's your conduct, it's your upright conduct. Legalism changes that virtue into sin. It takes a person that starts set out maybe with good intentions, and the problem is he did not stay that way. Those things, those desires, and his habits were turned into actual wickedness. Legalism is the corruption of virtue, the leading thought of my definition. Also, it does this through a wrong idea regarding commandments, regarding laws. Legalism is, of course, lawism. So it's some sort of mistake made with those things. So legalism, as I understand it, as I think we've derived from all that we've studied in the Bible so far in this series, it's the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. Now, in order to sort of move through that idea with you and try to put it all together based on what we've seen, try to make sure that you have a good understanding of it, I want to do 4 things today in this message. The first is I want to restate all that we've learned so far. So a jet tour of the first 4 messages so that it's all fresh in your mind and you can see the connection between those things and this definition I've given you. Second thing I want to do is explain the exact wording of my definition, understand why I said one thing and maybe not something else. Hopefully that'll clarify things pretty well. And then the third thing I want to do is I would like to critique other definitions of legalism, not because I'm feeling very mean-spirited today, but just because it will help us, I think, understand why the definition I have given is, I think, better than what is often said by a lot of people. And then fourth and finally, I want to contrast legalism with externalism, which is something that might have come to your mind as we were talking about all these other things. Just what is the difference between those two concepts? And I think that'll help you understand both of them better, especially legalism. So very cerebral, but remember, it's the glory of kings to search out a matter, so that is what we're doing. We're going to be kingly about this and just try to be very careful with it and very deliberate. Now, before we get moving into all of that, I want to remind you about the twin goals of this series. I've said this, I think, in every message from the beginning. I plan to say it in every message from here on out. Our goal is twofold. First of all, I want our battle against legalism to be primarily inward. I want this to be an introspective kind of study. It's very easy to look for legalism in other groups and other people, do the whole stone throwing kind of thing. It's very easy to do that. But my desire is that you'd begin your application of these ideas with yourself and with this church, that we would examine ourselves and examine the rest of us here and just try to look out for one another and look out for ourselves and try to prevent ourselves from going down some of these paths we've been talking about that lead to this legalistic mentality. The other goal is to exercise a little more restraint in labeling other people as legalistic, which again is very easy to do. But the more I've studied legalism, the more I've come to believe that calling someone a legalist is a very weighty charge. This is not the kind of accusation you want to just throw out haphazardly without thinking about it. I think it's a very heavy thing. I have come to consider legalism to be equal to such things as idolatry or licentiousness, which would be in many ways the exact opposite of legalism, or just flat out unbelief. Those kinds of sins, we consider them very serious. I think legalism is up there with those kinds of sins. I think it's a very serious thing to call someone a legalist because it's a very weighty sin. So surely our dedication to ideals like love and truth and wisdom require us to be very sure someone actually is a legalist before we go so far and tell them that and try to correct them on something that may not actually be a problem for them. So again, more introspection toward ourselves here, a little more restraint toward other people as we talk about legalism. That's the big two things that I want to do in this whole series, very relevant as we talk about the definition of legalism. So to begin, let's do some review, right? I want to restate all that we have learned so far in this series in the first 4 messages. Hopefully you liked those messages the first time, so that this will not be too tedious to review them again. But if it was not that way, I apologize. This is kind of necessary. The past 4 messages are my only sources for my definition of legalism, because I tried to base those 4 messages off of biblical teaching as well as I knew how. And so really, those are my sources. I mean, those first 4 messages, those are the only things that inform what I'm trying to do here as I define legalism. So let's make use of those things that we learned. My first message was just an introduction to the whole series, just the typical kind of thing I do when I begin something new. And I did make a few points that were very relevant for defining legalism, how to do it, how not to do it. Chiefly, one of the reasons that I gave for why this series is so long and perhaps so tedious is because legalism is so difficult to define. It's not an easy word. The first problem being that it's not used in the Bible. The word legalism, by and large, overwhelming majority of English Bible translations do not use the word legalism because there's no Greek or Hebrew word that is it is translated legalism that you can easily translate as such. So you have to biblically define a term that is nowhere in the Bible. That's a challenge. The second problem with defining legalism was that the word legalism is a purely accusatory term. You only use it when charging someone else with wrongdoing. No one actually claims to be a legalist. If I were to ask you today, who here is a legalist, no one's going to raise their hand, and no one ever will, because no one wants to claim that. No one claims the title. So you can never ask another legalist what it means to be a legalist, as you can do with so many other words. And the third problem is that Christians have different understandings of what legalism is. They all kind of have their own ideas, and those ideas tend to jar against one another. Two groups might be calling each other legalistic at the same time, and that's fair game because we all have such different understandings of the word. So very hard to define. So hard to define that we might want to forget about the word altogether, just discard it, and not bother with it. But the point that I made to you on all of that was that we need this word. We need this word because the Bible actually does talk about certain mistakes that we make with regard to the use of the whole idea of law and the use of commandments. We need the word legalism to represent what is an honest problem detailed by the Bible. So we have to define this word. It might be difficult, but you don't have a choice. You have to deal with this. So that was the whole gist of my introduction, at least the things that I said about defining legalism. Now my second message, we actually got into some more direct biblical teaching. I called that message Proper Laws for the Christian. And the whole idea was to define legalism by negation, say what legalism is not. I thought that was a very good first step. And the whole idea is that legalism does not refer to a desire to obey proper laws. That is, laws that God actually wants you to follow. Those things are not legalistic. That was the whole point of that second message. And the proper laws, as I defined them, were the law of conscience, the law of government, to some degree the law of Moses, and then most importantly, the law of Christ. And I singled out the law of Christ as most important because Christ is the highest and best revelation of God's will for us. His teachings and his examples are paramount over and against anything else. So those things, those are the proper laws. Those things are not legalistic. Your desire to obey those four things is perfectly biblical, assuming that your understanding of them is correct. And of course, there can be misunderstandings. That's where you start to get into a legalistic direction. But having a right understanding of those things and trying to live by those things, those are not legalistic. So, definition by negation. As we define legalism, none of that is involved in there. All that stuff is excluded because all that stuff is right, the proper laws. Third message is where things got really serious, where I gave you a highly detailed handout and everything. I was describing what I consider to be the 5 forms of legalism. Get used to that phrase because we're not going to drop it at any point in this series. The 5 forms of legalism, as I understand them, gave you an adequate summary of every biblical example of misusing the concept of law, which I gave as my working definition at the very beginning. Misapplication or misusing the concept of law. I went through the Bible, found a bunch of passages that I thought dealt with that, and I crunched those as well as I knew how into 5 kinds of mistakes, and those are the 5 forms of legalism. I want to summarize those for you just to get them more into your head. First, there was negligent legalism, which is just a way of saying that you neglect a greater command in favor of lesser commands. You actually reverse the priorities of God's law and turn mountains into molehills and molehills into mountains. That is what I call negligent legalism. The second kind was oppositional legalism. The idea being opposing. The whole idea being that you misapply a command from God, so that it actually opposes some other good work, something else that God wants you to do. So in oppositional legalism, you take things that God actually wants and you make them jar against each other, usually so that one kind of falls out. That's oppositional legalism. You make the law of God oppose the law of God. The third form was original legalism, which is what I call this enforcement of rules that have their origin in human wisdom. God didn't give these commands. Some human thought them up, and they sound good, and so they got really popular, but they're not from God. They're original legalism, as I call it. Fourth, the most notorious kind, redemptive legalism, the whole idea of salvation by works, or to give you the fuller definition, the attempt to obtain eternal redemption by obeying commandments. rather than trusting in the work of Christ. That's redemptive legalism. And then finally, the most ambiguous kind, which will have its own message later on to define it more clearly, Mosaic legalism. That is an application of the law of Moses in a non-Christian manner, which of course is a very tricky topic. How do we actually do anything with the law of Moses? Seems like a very foreign thing to read sometimes, but there is a form of legalism that misapplies that law, and we have to have that category in our mind. So those were the 5 forms. And my whole aim, of course, again, was to link my understanding of legalism as closely to Scripture as possible. And I believe that the 5 forms allow us to do that because they're basically descriptions of the kind of mistakes you see people in the Bible make, things that the Bible actually kind of confronts from time to time. I think that's the best way to keep this stuff rooted in the Bible. So that's what I was trying to do with those 5 forms. My 4th message, the last message I gave, was very similar in concept. I called it the Portrait of a Legalist, which was based mainly around trying to figure out the kinds of sins or vices, the term that I use more common, the vices which are most common to legalism. Same idea, going through the passages of Scripture which mention these legalistic problems and see what kind of sins actually come out of the people that practice those mistaken ideas. And I identified 3 of them for you. The first vice was contentiousness. The legalist tends to criticize and quarrel very often with other people, believing himself to be absolutely right, believing himself to be God's holy agent of law, that kind of thing. So contentiousness, that was the first vice. The second vice, as I named it, was dependence on lawyers, which lawyers I defined as being the experts that the legalist has in their law system. Whoever they look to, whatever teachers they follow, as being the experts in what God requires of them. And of course I said that it's necessary, if you're going to be a legalist, to get to that point, just because you stress laws so much and maybe even invent so many laws that you have to have a group of people that keep track of them. And you become dependent on those people. You become slaves to the lawyers, so to speak, because of your dependence on the idea of law. And then the third sin, or the third vice, was hypocrisy, which was a very common one. Hypocrisy, I thought, flowed very naturally from many forms of legalism, just based on the nature of what they are. But more importantly, you have this idea in legalism, the numbing of your conscience, basically. You have all these laws that you can't keep or don't keep, and eventually it gets to the point where your conscience is fine with that. And so your conscience becomes numb to ideas of righteousness, and you just become an all-out hypocrite. You do things for show, you do things with a lack of genuineness, and you just become hypocritical in your whole life. So biblically speaking, and the point I made here was that no person is a legalist unless his beliefs and practices have actually spawned these kinds of flaws. You can come in and out of the forms of legalism every so often just by mistake, just because of the difficulty of figuring out what God wants you to do. But a legalist is a person so dedicated to those forms of legalism that they have actually devolved, so to speak, into a less righteous kind of person. They become contentious or hypocritical, or they've lost the ability to think for themselves and they just do what their experts tell them. That kind of thing. You're not a legalist until you get to that point. That was the idea I was making. I advised you to stop looking for legalistic practices and start looking more for legalistic people, because I think that's where you really start to see legalism. You see it in the character of people. The kinds of ways that they live, the ways that they are. Not so much their mistaken ideas. And that was the 4th message. That was the last one I gave. Now, I hope that the connection between all of that and the definition I gave you for legalism at the very beginning is pretty plain, but just in case it isn't, I want to dedicate my second point here to explaining the exact wording of my definition. How I move from all those 4 messages and everything in them, all the hopefully biblical ideas that I gave you, and my definition that I gave you here at the beginning of this message. And since I live in Hannibal, I will not pass by this opportunity to quote Mark Twain. One of the more useful things he said, this is a quote from him, a letter he wrote to some friend of his. The difference between the almost right word and the right word is the difference between the lightning bug and the lightning. I think of that very often in terms of just trying, as I seek to define words, you know I do that very often. Well, you got to get it right, okay? You're going to define these words. You got to choose the right words as you talk about something, not vague or ambiguous terms, but the right one. And I spent a lot of time crafting my definition of legalism, the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. I'm trying to hit you with lightning and not just little lightning bugs. You know, I don't want to do that. I want to give you ideas and words and concepts that are actually going to help you as you think about what legalism is, as you try to avoid it on your own, and as you interact with other people. So we're trying to be full of lightning here as I give my definition. Now, to begin with this, I use, if you notice this, 3 terms to describe my 5 forms of legalism, which is kind of weird. I used 3 terms to describe 5 forms of legalism. You know, I mentioned misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments, which I hope you found odd because I put so much emphasis on my 5 forms of legalism. It was one of the first things I did, you know, as I really started to work through this issue, develop those 5 forms. I really impressed them upon you. I gave you a cheat sheet with all 5 forms on them, with their definitions and proof passages. And now it seems like I'm just dropping them and giving you 3 terms instead of 5. What am I doing here? Well, on the one hand, I have to admit, hitting you with 5 terms would be a little harder to memorize in case you actually want to memorize this definition, which would be nice. And if you do try to do that, I figured 3 terms would be better than 5, just for the sake of getting it more firmly in your head. I know I find it easier to do 3 terms rather than 5. But at the same time, there's another point here. Those 3 terms actually do give a pretty good summary of the 5 forms, if you think about them. First of all, inventing commandments. Okay, one of them, that certainly represents original legalism, where a bunch of, you know, people who think they're wise, you know, give you laws that surely God would endorse, you know, surely, but of course they're just making it up out of their own brains. Well, inventing commandments, that represents original legalism pretty well, but also represents perhaps redemptive legalism, right? Because as you try to, quote, earn your salvation, ultimately you're making up rules for that. The Bible doesn't give you rules for how to earn your salvation. That's not how it works. So if you start going down that direction, you're pretty much inventing stuff. I mean, God didn't tell you, do this and you'll be saved. You know, he pretty much said, repent and believe. But beyond that, anything else that someone would make, that's just pure invention. So the whole idea of inventing commandments, that kills, you know, 2 of the 5 forms of legalism. That represents those things. Also, you have over-exalting commandments. Why do I choose that phrase? Well, it certainly represents negligent legalism, where you reverse the priorities of God's law, turn the lesser commands into more important commands in your life, forget about all the greater ones. You're certainly over-exalting commandments that are of lesser importance. But also, think again about redemptive legalism. Think about what you do in that way of thinking. You have actually taken something that is just a part of the Christian life and made it how to actually be a Christian. You have over-exalted commandments from being just something that a Christian does and needs to do to being the secret to eternal bliss and happiness. I mean, that's what you've done. You have truly over-exalted commandments in doing that. So again, you have that one phrase, but it represents 2 of the forms of legalism. And then you come to misapplying commandments, which really covers a lot of ground. Certainly oppositional legalism, where your misapplication of one command from God goes against something else God wants. That's certainly a misapplication. Mosaic legalism, you take this commandment from the law of Moses and you misapply it in some way that a Christian should never do. Misapplication. Also, once more, redemptive legalism. You misapplied commandments and now you think you're saved by what you do. So misapplying commandments, that covers a lot of ground as well. Yes, I know I stressed the 5 forms and those are important for clear thought, but in an actual definition, I think 3 terms do just well. So, misapplying, inventing, over-exalting commandments, that makes up the tail end of my definition, and I think that's fine. I think that works. Now, another feature of my definition is that I refer specifically to the corruption of virtue. You know, the transformation of virtue into something else, the corruption, going down, devolving, ruining something, causing something to decay, corruption, whatever you want to say to define that word, corruption. That's the word I chose to use. I could have said loss of virtue and been content with that. I might have just said it's wickedness, but of course wickedness is a very vague term. There's a lot of forms of wickedness that you could get into. None of that really makes the lightning flash, so to speak. So I wanted to nail it down to a term that I thought really hit the nail on the head. And the term that I chose was the corruption of virtue. Because one of the most fascinating things about legalism, the more I study it, one of the more fascinating things about it is the way it corrupts, the way it ruins something, the way it causes a decay. The legalist begins with a desire to do what is right. No one starts down a legalistic path because he wants to be sinful. No one does. The whole reason he starts to focus his mind so much on the idea of commandment is because in some way, for some reason, he wants to obey God. He has that motive. That's there. Now, along the way, the problem is he ends up developing his own form of sin. And this desire to be holy turns into something quite different, which is why I call it the corruption of virtue. He actually went downhill. He thought he was going to go uphill. Then he went downhill. It actually led to a corruption of his own desires, which originally were well-stated desires. The legalist, in other words, is not like other sinners. When you compare the legalist to other kinds of wicked people, he's in a category of his own. Many sinners, they glorify their sin. You know, they want to make sin look like something awesome. You often hear them say they're looking forward to the party in hell. You know, they want to go to hell because a party in hell is better than a party in heaven. And they have this ridiculous idea of really exalting their sins. The legalist, meanwhile, goes in the complete opposite direction. He wants to prove how righteous he is. He wants to show you, look at how many of these rules I follow. Look at all the things I do. That's the direction he goes. He sincerely believes that he is God's agent of holiness. He really thinks that. But the problem is, as he thinks he's going uphill, he's going downhill. As he thinks he's getting more holy, his holiness is being corrupted. So as I define legalism, I keep coming back to that word, corruption. It's the decay of virtue. It's the corruption of virtue. I just can't get away from that concept because of how fascinating legalism is on that point. Now, one more interesting feature here on why I worded my definition the way I did. My definition is actually backwards. You know, it's actually reversed of what it maybe ought to be, because I define legalism as the corruption of virtue caused by, these other things. You say, well, wait a minute, if the corruption of virtue is the result, shouldn't that be at the end of your definition? I mean, just moving chronologically, shouldn't you start with the causes? The misapplication of commandments, the inventing of commandments, the over-exalting of commandments. Shouldn't you start with the causes and then move to the results? Wouldn't that be more orderly? Yes, it would be more orderly, but it would be completely contrary to what I'm trying to do with this definition. I'm trying to exploit a linguistic trick where if you want to give something emphasis, you put it at the front of what you're saying, and I'm trying to put a lot of emphasis on this corruption of virtue. That's why it's at the front of my definition. I consider it so important for having a right understanding of what legalism is. That corruption of virtue needs to be the lead thought in your thoughts about legalism. And I'll tell you why. First of all, I think it's easier to identify legalism that way. And I talked about this in my last message, but I want to come back to it because it's become very large in my own mind. Whether you're looking inwardly at yourself or looking at other people, corrupt virtue is a dead giveaway for the legalist. You see a guy that wants to argue with everyone. You see a big hypocrite. You see someone that just kind of follows their teachers around without even thinking about why they're teaching what they're teaching. You see those kind of people, dead giveaway for legalism. With other kinds of things like the 5 forms of legalism, you sit there, you're wondering, is he committing this problem? Is it really that bad? Is it really having an effect on him? Is he a legalist? It's kind of hard to tell. But if you see someone that fits the profile of a Pharisee, like we talked about last time when I talked, you see that profile, boom, dead giveaway, that person is a legalist. It's so much more useful for identifying legalism if you think first about what it does to a person's righteousness. It corrupts virtue. I have another reason for beginning my definition with the corruption of virtue, and that is it actually ties all the 5 forms of legalism together into a nice, neat bundle. One package. You know how orderly I am, how I like these things to be? Well, the corruption of virtue functions as that kind of tie, that kind of rope that ropes it all together. From the beginning of my thoughts on legalism, when I really started plowing through this issue, I wanted to find a kind of bottom line idea, that sums up all legalism, some kind of common bond or a common denominator, to use a mathematical term. It was, so to speak, the holy grail of my study, to find some way to take all these different kinds of legalism and find some way that they're all one thing, okay? One kind of thing. Yeah, I talked about the 5 forms of legalism. I don't really want 5 forms of legalism. I know I like to categorize things and classify things, but I want one idea. I want one thing to really tie it all together. I believe I found that when I started to see in these biblical passages that legalism always causes a problem for the actual character of the person that practices it. Whether it's contentiousness or hypocrisy or a dependence on lawyers, you always see the downhill movement of that person's virtue. You always see the corruption of virtue in that. No matter which of the 5 forms it is they're practicing, or you're practicing if you're the legalist, no matter what, you have that common bond. So really, I've come to think that the essence of legalism lies not in any one of the 5 forms, but primarily in the effects of what those things do to you. Those wrong ideas causing you to become a person of less righteousness. That's my common bond. So I think it's very useful to focus on that and put it at the front of my definition so that it's at the front of your thoughts on the matter. And finally, my last reason for leading off with this in my definition, the corruption of virtue is the great price of being a legalist. It's the big problem. It's the thing that happens that you don't want to happen. If you realized it was happening, you would call everything off, but of course you usually don't just because of the blindness of your eyes. It's the great price of being a legalist. The problem is not that you misunderstood some command. The problem is not that you got too creative for your own good in trying to figure out rules for your life. Those aren't the real problem. The real problem is something very different. Any Christian can make a mistake. As I said last time, any Christian can make a mistake from time to time on learning what God wants them to do. Any Christian can have that problem. The big problem for the legalist is that he has taken those things so far that he has actually hurt himself. He has actually dealt a terrible blow to his own life, to his own eternity, most likely. I mean, at the very best case scenario, he has no reward for all of his zeal. All of his zeal for keeping all these rules has become completely misplaced, and he has no reward from God about it. But at the worst case scenario, he's damned himself. I mean, if he's gone over into maybe redemptive legalism, I mean, he's just gone all the way down. I mean, that's the big problem. The problem is not a mistake in your mind. The problem is what you did to yourself. That corruption of virtue has become a great weight around your neck, sucking you down. I mean, you didn't hurt other people so much, you hurt yourself. I mean, that's what you call shooting yourself in the foot. That's the great price to pay for being a legalist. It's not all the little problems with how you understand all the commands of God. The problem is what you did to your own character as a person. So I want to lead off with that so that you'll never forget it. And that's why my definition is the corruption of virtue caused by misapplication, inventing, and overexalting commandments. That part is lesser. The corruption of virtue is greater. I think it's very important to keep that toward the front. And that is why I worded my definition the way I did. Hopefully that is lightning and not a lightning bug. I guess that's for you to decide, but I did my best. Hopefully Mark Twain would approve of the way I handled that. But moving on to the third point, the third thing I wanted to do, perhaps the ugliest part of this message. I really don't want to do this, but I think it's useful, so we're going to do this and try to do it in a good attitude. I want to critique some other definitions of legalism. And there are many. I have narrowed it down to 4, but I have chosen these 4, again, I'm not sitting here trying to take shots at other people. That's not what I'm trying to do. I just want to show you that why these other definitions maybe don't hit the nail on the head so much, that a fully biblical definition of legalism needs to be a little different. Ultimately, all these other definitions make the same mistake, if it helps you understand why I've chosen them. They all make the mistake of identifying one form of legalism as the form of legalism. They're too narrow, in other words. I believe my definition makes a very good effort to encompass all the forms of legalism that you see opposed in the Bible. These other definitions, I feel like they've gotten too narrow. Maybe they have identified just one form of legalism as all legalism, and I think that's not very helpful. So that's why I'm going to critique all of these. And again, to maybe at least take a stab at a biblical justification of what I'm doing here, Proverbs 18:17, the one who states his case first seems right until the other comes and examines him. Okay, so imagine these other definitions as people coming to examine my definition and to try to interact with me and argue with me, and I'm going to try to use them, to beef up my own argument and show you that I think what I'm doing here is correct, but just using them to do that, listening to the other side. That's the basic idea. So hopefully I am being wise, as the book of Proverbs would define wisdom, in trying to incorporate these other definitions into my sermon. Okay, definition number one, the first one that I don't really like so much. Legalism is the attempt to gain salvation by works. Many people would define legalism strictly in that sense. Very commonly, a lot of Christians, you ask them what legalism is, their mind goes there first, that it's a way of salvation, a wrong way of salvation, trying to gain salvation by things that you do. And after all, one of my 5 forms of legalism is redemptive legalism, which is the attempt to gain eternal redemption by keeping commandments. Salvation by works. It seems to fit right in, right? I mean, why am I complaining? Redemptive legalism is very much a part of my discussion. This first definition is pretty much that. So what's the problem? Well, again, the problem is that it's just one of the 5 forms of legalism. There's more to it. There's more to legalism than just an attempt to gain salvation by works. And I think it's important to stress that, because if a person has just redemptive legalism as their understanding of legalism, they could be a very legalistic person and not even realize it. I mean, they could say, oh, I'm not a legalist. I believe in the grace of God through Jesus Christ and faith and all that. And they might not even realize all the other kinds of legalism that they commit. I mean, because they think legalism is just this over here, and they're forgetting this whole list of things that they do that is very legalistic. They just don't realize it because their definition is over here. So again, I just think this definition is very narrow. I don't want to put this forward as the definition of legalism, this idea of salvation by works. I think it's a kind of legalism, but just one kind of legalism, not the whole thing. Definition number 2, same kind of problem. Definition number 2 is legalism is the strict obedience to commandments. Emphasis on that word strict, right? Very often, when one Christian accuses another Christian of being legalistic, what they mean is that that Christian is trying very hard to obey certain kinds of rules and usually succeeds in keeping those rules. They're very strict in their understanding of what God requires of them, very hard line. So the idea of strict obedience is very much the way a lot of people define legalism. I decided, however, that strict obedience has no real place in my own definition. Again, the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. Not really the idea of strictness in there anywhere. I deliberately left that out because I don't think it's very fair. And my chief reason for rejecting that definition of legalism is because it would make every true Christian a legalist in some sense of the term, right? And would you not say that you are strict in some ways? For example, would you believe in strictly loving your neighbor as yourself? I mean, do you take that seriously? Do you try hard to love your neighbor as yourself? I mean, do you consider that a strict commandment for the Christian life? How about loving God? The greatest commandment. Surely there's a command that you try to keep with some degree of strictness in your own life. I mean, to some degree, you would say that you hold to certain things very strictly. So are we all legalists? I mean, I told you last time, if you have this definition of legalism that makes every single Christian a legalist, it's not a very useful definition. And I think if you have this idea of strict obedience as your understanding of legalism, you're not really going the right direction. Eventually, you have to soften that definition, right? You say, well, Stan, what I really mean is strict obedience to commands that are not very important. To which I say, oh, you mean negligent legalism. You know, the kind of legalism that switches the priority of God's commandments, turns greater commands into lesser commands into greater commands. In other words, this definition of legalism is, again, just one form of legalism and not all legalism. So again, same problem. Yeah, strict obedience to lesser commandments and ignoring the greater ones. Yeah, that's a problem. Yeah, that's a kind of legalism, but that's not all legalism. There are other kinds of legalism, and your definition has to reflect that. Okay, definition number 3. Probably the hardest to talk about briefly. Legalism is preferring the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. Very often you hear this kind of terminology. People talk about legalism. You've got to understand what those phrases mean. When they talk about the letter of the law, that phrase is usually understood as referring to what the law says, regardless of why that law was given, regardless of any other laws given with it. You're focusing totally on the wording of that one commandment, the letter of the law. Meanwhile, the spirit of the law, as this is often understood, refers to maybe the reason that law was given, or the attitude required for truly keeping that law, or maybe even taking into account other laws given with that law to better understand it. Letter of the law, spirit of the law. That's how a lot of people talk about this. And some people say that legalism is preferring the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. I know it still seems kind of hazy to me, but that's the way a lot of people talk about it. My big problem with this definition is, of course, the same kind of thing. I consider it too narrow. I think it targets one form of legalism, or maybe a few kinds of legalism, but not the whole thing. So, for example, oppositional legalism, where you take one command of God and misapply it so that it opposes some other good work. I can see how you might call that preferring the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. For example, don't work on the Sabbath. Okay, no work on the Sabbath. Well, Jesus comes along and starts healing on the Sabbath. And they say, well, he shouldn't be working on the Sabbath. Like, okay, well, yeah, no work on the Sabbath, but these healings are from God. And these healings allow people to rest in the most ultimate way possible. It frees them from their disabilities and from their sicknesses. Surely this applies. Surely this is in keeping with the spirit of the law, right? Okay, you can argue that way. I can see how this whole letter spirit idea fits very well as a description of oppositional legalism. But again, that's just one kind of legalism, not all of them. Fourth definition, then we'll move on from this. Stop tearing down other people's work, which don't necessarily like doing this, especially on this last one, my goodness. Definition 4, legalism is a reliance upon law. And I really don't want to talk about this one, but I'm going to anyway, just to give you an idea. This is actually Charles Leiter's definition of legalism in his book, The Law of Christ. If you go to his appendix where he talks about legalism, his definition is reliance on law keeping for attaining salvation or sanctification. Okay, that's his definition of legalism. Again, a very common definition, which in truth was my definition of legalism for a long time. That's exactly the way I would have described it. You rely upon the law, whether to earn your salvation or to get more holy in the Christian life. One way or another, you're relying upon law. And again, there is, of course, a lot of truth in this. We'll talk more about this in later stages of the series. The big problem I have, once more, is just that I really don't think it really targets all the different kinds of legalism that there is. To me, it seems like there are some kinds of legalism that aren't really a result of reliance on the law, not really that kind of idea. I think sometimes it is more a matter of misunderstanding a law or misapplying a law, which is why in my definition I talk about the misapplication of law. I think sometimes that's more of the problem. For example, a negligent legalist, one who, spends all this effort tithing exactly, but then forgets about, love, mercy, justice, and patience, and all those things. Well, it's not really that he's relying upon the law. More accurately, he's just misunderstood things. He misunderstood the importance of this very lesser commandment and totally misunderstood the importance of these other things. There's a glitch in his thinking. It's not so much to me a matter of reliance. It seems more like a misunderstanding or a misapplication. He went wrong in his thinking, and he carried through with that to the point where it started to have an effect on his character. So yeah, definition 4, it's probably the least problematic. I think it hits a lot of things right, but I just don't think it hit the bullseye very well for talking about all forms of legalism, which is why I did not make it my definition of legalism for this series. I wouldn't necessarily have you call up Charles Leiter and tell him that I'm offering a different view, but by the way, I found his appendix on legalism very helpful. That's on the record, hopefully, if he ever sees this. But again, definition number 4, I just didn't want to go that direction with it. So again, I just want to talk about those definitions just to fine-tune the definition that I gave, why I think it is as exact as I can possibly make it, in trying to give a very biblical understanding of what legalism is. So that's why I did that. Okay, last thing, and then we'll be done wrangling over this word for this time. Fourth and final point, contrasting legalism with externalism. A very, very similar concept that I think it'd be helpful to talk about. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to make this too complicated, but first we have to define externalism. And I am not going to spend 5 messages to do that. I'm just going to do this very quickly. What is externalism? When we talk about externalism, I mean the observation of visible aspects of religion without any concern for the invisible aspects of religion. So very much focusing on the externals, not so much on anything inside of you. Externalism is what we mean by going through the motions. Talk about a person that just kind of does things that seem right on the outside, not really giving any thought to the interior, to his mind, his thoughts, his desires, his emotions, nothing like that. I tried to think of a passage that reflects that externalistic idea very well. There's a passage here in Isaiah 58 toward the beginning where I think you see that kind of mentality. I just want to read this as an example, one example of externalism. Cry aloud, do not hold back, lift up your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their transgression, to the house of Jacob their sins. Okay, so what is the sin of Israel? What is the transgression of Israel at this point? They seek me daily and delight to know my ways, as if they were a nation that did righteousness and did not forsake the judgment of their God. They ask of me righteous judgments. They delight to draw near to God. Well, what's the problem? I thought he was talking about their sins. I thought he was talking about their transgression. This all sounds pretty good. Well, it looks good. Externally, it looks good. Let's keep going. Why have we fasted? Here's the people talking to God. Why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? Behold, here's the answer. In the day of your fast, you seek your own pleasure and oppress all of your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and to fight and to hit with a wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice be heard on high. So they say, look, we're holy. We're following God. We're fasting. See, fasting is holy. We're abstaining from food. We're humbling ourselves so that God will hear us. And God says, yeah, you're fast, but you hit this person over here. You oppressed your workers over here. You're quarreling with this other person over here. This isn't fasting. Oh, sure, it looks holy, but it only looks holy. That is externalism. The externalist will fast only because it looks holy, but they don't care about anything else. They will attend church, they'll give money, they'll go through all the rituals, they'll hang up Bible verses in their kitchen, they'll do all those kinds of things that look really righteous, but when it comes down to it, on their inside, there's no desire to follow God, there's no communion with God, there's no concern for their own soul, no concern for other people, none of the things that are at the true heart of what religion is, especially Christianity, what the gospel is. So for this kind of person, the external outweighs the eternal. That's the way they view things. They're totally focused on these visible aspects of religion to the exclusion of anything else. Now, perhaps you've been sitting there listening to me talk about legalism, and meanwhile you're saying to yourself, externalism, right? You're talking about externalism. They're the same thing, aren't they? And probably some of you at least have been saying that. And I admit they are very similar. To a lot of people, they just sort of use the terms interchangeably. Think about this. Think about the many similarities between these ideas. Both terms are purely accusatory. You only use them to charge other people with wrongdoing. No one claims to be a legalist, and no one claims to be externalist. No one says, I'm an externalist, I'm a Christian externalist. No one says that. No one will claim that title for their own, just like with legalism. Secondly, both legalism and externalism give rise to much hypocrisy, much shallowness, much man-pleasing. The legalist suffers from so many rules that his conscience becomes numb, and all he cares about now is looking holy. Doesn't care about actually being holy. Well, the externalist also wants to appear holy without actually being holy on the inside. Very similar. They both lead to hypocrisy. Also, think about this. Every single one of my 5 forms of legalism can be expressed in a very external way. Usually it's something you do out here. It's something that's very visible. In fact, you might say that they are usually external. That usually the 5 forms of legalism express themselves in ways that are highly visible. So I admit legalism and externalism are very, very similar. I had to sit down and think for quite some time about how they were different just to figure that out. So, I mean, yeah, they are very similar. I think they occur very often together. I mean, I think that's very true. That said, I do think they are distinct problems. I think they are their own kind of thing. And I think pondering that this morning will help us better understand both of them, especially legalism. So here's the chief difference I would give you. I think the chief difference is primarily a matter of motivation. What guns the legalist on in his legalism? What drives the externalist in his externalism? I think that's where you see the difference. Legalism gets its name from the word legal, from the word law. This is an insistence upon rules and commands and things of that nature. This is the kind of person who needs rules for everything. Kind of like me and the way I normally do things. You know, where's the handbook? What do the directions say? That's the way I kind of live my life. I'm the kind of person that would very easily fall into the trap of legalism because it's a very law-based mentality. The kind of person that's always looking for the rules, and legalism grows out of that kind of obsession. Externalism, however, I think has a different source. I think its motivation is different. Externalism gets its name from the word external. You know, the idea of things being visible, the idea of appearance, the way things look. Externalism grows out of that compulsion for appearances, to make sure things look okay, that they appear to be fine. There are kinds of people that want everything to look a certain way. That kind of compulsion drives them, I think, toward a very externalistic view of religion. So the chief difference, I think, between legalism and externalism is motivation. You might also think of the difference this way. This is slightly different. I think the same flavor, but maybe a different way to approach it. The legalist thinks too much, while the externalist thinks too little. This is one of the ways I came to view it as I started thinking about these things. And so opposite kinds of problems, both in terms of how they think about things, how they think about their duty to God primarily. In legalism, they think too much. They apply themselves a little too vigorously to this problem. The legalist believes that righteousness is primarily a matter of analysis. We have these laws, we have these rules. Okay, well, what do we think about these things? What do we do about these things? We've got to think carefully about the application of every rule. What about this situation? What about this situation? Do we apply the rules differently? If there are no rules, you have to create those rules, because God forbid that we should find ourselves in a situation where there is no rule to tell us what to do. So we got to create a rule. And then we got to remember the rule. Then we got to think about the application of that rule. How does that work in this situation? How does that work in the other situation? Just very, very vigorous. If there are disagreements among Christians about these things, they must be solved. You got to have one rule for everybody, because there's no way we could allow a difference of opinion on this matter. We got to make everyone conform to one rule. We got to argue. We got to fight for these things. Very, very vigorous in terms of analysis. Legalism typically becomes a very mental kind of religion, very cerebral. The problem is that ignores a huge part of religion, especially if you're talking about true religion, Christianity, where you have a very large spiritual aspect to things. Sometimes the right answer is letting God lead you. The idea of, letting God lead you, we have that concept for a reason. Sometimes the right answer to a question is leaving God to judge the matter. Rather than passing judgment on your brothers or sisters in Christ, maybe you should leave the matter for God and what He decides on the day of judgment, if it's a difficult matter of who is right and who is wrong. Maybe in times like that, the answer is not to make a rule and impose it on everybody. Maybe the answer is to leave off doing that. The legalism, I think, in his zeal for thinking very carefully about the laws of God, has actually thought a little too much about them and has been driven by those things. Meanwhile, the externalist makes the exact opposite mistake and thinks too little. The externalist is very shallow in his thoughts about righteousness. He doesn't get very far down in terms of depth. The externalist perhaps is the kind of person who says to himself, I really need to turn over a new leaf in my life. I haven't really been a religious person in the past, but now I'm going to be. I'm gonna improve myself. So he looks at religious people. He just kind of sees the sorts of things they do, the sort of motions they go through, the sort of practices they have, and he looks at those things and he says, I can do that. I can go to church. I can give a little bit of my money to God. I know I have enough. I can pray when everyone else prays. I can have posters hanging up on my wall that say, nice little Christian things. I can do these things. I can do this. And he does all these things, and now he says, behold, I am now righteous. But he hasn't even scratched the surface of what righteousness is. He hasn't thought about it enough. He hasn't thought carefully, and he hasn't thought honestly about what it means to serve God. He honestly thinks he can just go through these very external things, and that's all God wants. As though God has no claim on his thought life, no claim on how he feels, no claims on how he treats other people, no claims on any of these other things. He honestly thinks, because he hasn't thought about it enough, that this is just okay, that he can stop at this very surface understanding of what obedience is. He doesn't seem to realize that his righteousness is just a costume he puts on. He doesn't get it. So again, you have the externalist. He just doesn't think carefully enough about these things. And then the legalist, he thinks too carefully and he's gone bonkers with it. They've gone in two opposite directions. Two different kinds of things have driven them in the directions where they have gone. And that, I think, is one of the differences between legalism and externalism. They're kind of like the phrase hustle and bustle. You use them together, but they're different things. Well, legalism and externalism. Yes, you're going to find them together very often, but technically they're not the same thing. And I think it would help to have them clearly separated in your mind so that you know what you're dealing with and how to deal with it in the future, whether in yourself or with somebody else. And that is the last thing I wanted to do in trying to clarify this understanding of legalism. So it's been pretty rigorous here trying to figure out what a word means, but I think this is very practical for what we're trying to do here. It's hard to fight against something if you don't know what it is. You go looking for a problem, you got to know what the problem is. That's why we've been trying to define this term, and that's what I've been trying to do today, just trying to tie all these things together. So again, first, I just sort of restated everything that I did in my prior messages, trying to get the raw information from Scripture that we need. Secondly, I explained the exact wording of my definition, why I said what I said, trying to get things very narrow, very specific. Third, I critiqued some other definitions of legalism, just trying to point out the shortcomings in them. Usually they make the mistake of focusing on one kind of legalism rather than all kinds of legalism. And then finally, I just contrasted legalism and externalism, trying to get a better understanding of both of them. And that means we finally have our definition of legalism, the corruption of virtue caused by misapplying, inventing, or over-exalting commandments. And with that, we are only about 1/3 of the way through our series on legalism. That was just trying to get to the point where we know what it is. Now we got to do other things about it. So where are we going next? Well, I told you that after we got done with all of the hard work on definition, we were going to do some things on clarification, trying to make sure that this idea of legalism is very clear in your mind, so you don't apply it to anything where it doesn't belong, so that you understand how relevant it is for various situations. We're going to be clarifying over the next several messages that I give. And the next time we're going to be talking about legalism and the law of Moses. In other words, clarifying what Mosaic legalism is. What does it mean to apply the law of Moses in a non-Christian manner? Very difficult question. I'm going to spend a whole message trying to clarify that. And that's where we're going to be going next time. So, that is the message for today. Again, just trying to tie everything we've seen so far together. Are there questions so far? I know I plan to clarify a lot of things in future messages, but don't be afraid to ask questions now. Don't be afraid to make objections. Certainly, I admit, in terms of finding a word that you can't actually find in the Bible, things get difficult. So I certainly don't claim to have all wisdom on the matter. But questions, comments, objections, anything now we can talk about.